Welcome to a new episode of the Autistic Reality podcast. I'm Alec Frazier for your wondrous journey through pop culture, disability, and other commentary. And I am at New York Comic Con 2019. And oh my effing God, I have...
My name is Diana Gabaldon, and I am the author of the Outlander series.
You heard that, folks. You heard it from her, not from me. I actually got here today, and I said I had an interview with Diana, and her staff found it hard to believe. So anyways, let's move on to some amazing questions. Here's the first one. Writing as you do about an era in which disabled people were seen as being cursed by God and autistic children were sometimes treated as changelings. I'm thinking Martin Luther had that point of view, for example. How frustrating is it to watch modern examples of superstition such as the anti-vaccine movement?
Oh, well, it's deeply frustrating to watch things that you know are actively dangerous and doing damage to, vulnerable members of the population when there is, evidence that can be evaluated. I'm not saying that people should believe things just because, the government tells you or someone else tells you, but you were equipped by God with a mind and logic and observation, and all of the evidence is very clear on the subjects such as vaccination. You can easily check it out, look things up, don't take anyone's word for anything, including the people who are telling you not to vaccinate, and you make up your own mind, but it's very, very clear as to where the preponderance of evidence lies.
Thank you very much. That's a very good, solid answer. So, we're going to skip around a bit. Ingenuity such as Claire's and immigrants such as Jamie make America great. Jamie is, in the very real sense, a refugee.
Yes.
What lessons does Outlander teach us in this matter, and how might they inform matters today?
Well, America is, in fact, a country of immigrants and refugees, largely, since the first explorers did a really good job in exterminating the native population, of whom there are only remnants left, and who are now, cultural refugees, so to speak. But the thing is that human nature, disregarding, ethnicities and national origins and so forth, is a very plastic thing. People's particular traditions and cultures are very important to them and should be preserved. But at the same time, this doesn't mean that you necessarily have to build a wall around those cultures in order to preserve them or keep them safe. In fact, the more widely they're shared, the better. And I would say that the Scottish immigrants are sort of a signpost in this regard. They refer to this now as the Scottish diaspora, which during various parts of the 18th century, large chunks of the Scottish population were transported or forced to leave for economic reasons, and a great many of them came here. Well, they did not abandon any part of their cultural tradition. They have a very vibrant oral and storytelling tradition, which they kept and shared with everybody around them. And, I have never once been accused of cultural appropriation for writing books that are set in Scotland or dealing with Scottish history. In fact, the Scottish government recently gave me an award for raising Scottish tourism 67%.
Significantly, yes.
Significantly, yeah. And so, this is an example of people who did not abandon their culture to assimilate. They kept it, they shared it widely, they were proud of it, but they didn't reject anybody else. And in fact, there's many instances of Scottish men intermarrying in the Indian tribes because the tribal traditions of the Native Americans were very similar to the native traditions of the Highlanders, which were similarly tribal in nature and deeply familial. So, they have clans, just as the Highlanders did, and the clan and family relationships, they felt quite at home, and the Native Americans accepted them on those grounds. They also did not reject people because of their origins or looking different or anything. The Native Americans very commonly adopted people from different places to help restore their own population. And this is one of the things that makes a population vital and prevents it from going extinct. It provides mutual protection, influx of new knowledge. This keeps a population healthy. And, refugees and immigrants are to be treasured.
So you mentioned the Scottish diaspora. This isn't a planned question, but you might be able to help me learn about my family.
I'll try.
As you know, I'm a Frazier, and I learned that my earliest American family came to Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, roughly, and they seem to be Quakers, the first few generations of them. Do you know anything about that?
Well, I know a lot about Quakers by this time because I have several in the books and all that. I don't know specifically about Montgomery, Pennsylvania, but there were a large number of Quakers in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, which, as you no doubt know, was founded by William Penn, who was himself a Quaker, hence the name of the city of brotherly love, which is, the basic tenet of Quakerism, or the Society of Friends, as they call it.
Yeah. So that's actually pretty darn fascinating, because many people assume that the Fraziers all fought in the British side on the Revolution, and not all of them did. Here's a good key question. In addition to your works of fiction, you have completed 2 excellent reference books, The Outlandish Companions. JD, you need these, honestly, both of them.
I'm sure you would enjoy them.
I am also a nonfiction author, and I brought a copy of my book for you.
Thank you.
And I find advice and discussion on nonfiction sorely lacking. Do you have thoughts you'd like to share on writing nonfiction, or tips?
Well, I was a scientist in my previous professional incarnation. I have a PhD in quantitative behavioral ecology, and I was a university professor for 12 years before I started writing novels. So I've written a lot of nonfiction in my time. And, the nuts and bolts of good writing are similar across all fields, fiction or nonfiction. A good sentence is a good sentence. And the thing is that the goals are somewhat different. In nonfiction, the author usually thinks that the transfer of information is the important thing, and they're not wrong. You need to transfer information, but it doesn't occur to them that they ought to be using the artistry that's available to them in composing this, and make what they're writing, interesting and elevating and beautiful to read. At the same time, they're transferring information, which is why you don't always find great nonfiction. It will tell you something, but it doesn't always tell it to you in an interesting or beautiful way, and I think it really should.
I think that just because it's nonfiction doesn't mean you can make a person laugh or cry or, show emotion.
Oh, yeah. No, for a long time, they taught graduate students, well, you have to keep the personal out of it because, this is strictly objective, but it's the evidence that's objective. The investigator is usually not objective at all. That is, they have a hypothesis that they're interested in supporting or disproving or whatever, and either way, it's valuable information. They are obliged to pass it on and to show the evidence that points one way or the other. But they were taught early on, and I got my PhD quite some time ago, so I was taught this as well, but I kind of disregarded it. They said, you should never say I. They should say it was shown that, rather than I did this and this is what it says. And I thought that was, well, you can, writing in the passive voice is usually not a good thing unless you're doing it for a specific effect, which you almost never are. And so I said, well, why should you write your entire scientific article in the passive voice? There's nothing wrong with saying I went out in the field and this is what I did, and this is what I think about it.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating, and you've given me some good tips, and I actually speak at conventions and share nonfiction tips here. This is important to me. There are a number of disabled characters and disability storylines in Outlander. How did you work to ensure that the depictions were genuine? Did you work with the disability community?
I talk to people who have disabilities of various kinds. I have several good friends who have, disabilities of varying kinds. But, you don't get to be my age without meeting a lot of people of a lot of different types. And so, I've known people. For instance, I was a volunteer reader for a group that's now called Learning Ally. It used to be called Recording for the Blind and Dyslexic. And I read for them for 27 years until I started traveling so much that I could no longer reliably show up once a week. But I've thought, not being able to read has got to be the worst thing in the world, and I could help with that.
Okay. Because we might be running low on time, I'll ask you the question that I ask everybody, and then any extra time we can ask whatever. An abysmally small number of disabled individuals currently work in creative fields. We desperately want to create, we want to act, to write, to illustrate, to do set design and makeup and CGI and costuming and plotting and everything else creative. How do you feel about this? What are your thoughts on fixing this problem?
Well, I definitely think any creative individual should have the opportunity to do it, given the way that industries work. However, I'd say that the basic problem here is one of communication, as in you need to be able to, a person who's being creative in one of the ways you mentioned, has to be able to communicate easily and openly with the people who are working on a project with them. If you were a makeup person, for instance, I was heavily made up the last 2 days by different makeup people, and both of them started by looking at my face and saying, what kind of look do you want? And I said, I want minimal looking makeup, nothing extreme in terms of skin and all that. I want most of the emphasis on my eyes, a nude lip, and visible shadow. And so they went very, very slowly, and they stopped periodically and said, is this about what you want, and encouraged me to say if I wanted something different or if I thought they should do more and so forth. But it was this constant little back and forth and very detailed. So I was not doing any of the work, but the communication was important. I didn't want to just sit down and have someone paint me, but I had an idea what I wanted to look like. They wanted to make me look that way, and so it was, how do we achieve this? And as I see it, the communication is going to be a difficulty in some instances. Now, if it's a physical disability, that might be a little easier to overcome because there's technology that you can use, in terms of voice enhancement and mobility and things like that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but I'd say technology overall will eventually give you much more access in those avenues. But
I have one extra little tiny question.
Yeah.
Your books are love stories.
Some of them, yeah. Parts of the books are
parts of it.
Oh yeah, no, there's love all through them, but they're not romances. Yeah.
But love is as powerful a force
as
anything else.
Absolutely, if not more so.
It's a very interesting age we live in, where that is not maybe exhibited on television and news and other things. Is that part of your personal feel, that compassion, love, family is as powerful as war?
Much more powerful. Yeah. No, love and family and connections. Faith in something larger than what we are. Excuse me, I mush up very easily. But yeah, all of those forms of love are what make the human race work. You will always find violence of one kind and another because we are animals, and whenever animals have to compete for a scarce resource, whether that be food or mates or whatever, you're going to find them butting heads, at least to chase the other person away, if not kill them. And so you do get violence. It's when you have abundance and people don't have to fight, in order to survive or whatever, that they achieve the most. We have had an unprecedented stretch of peace in the United States since World War II. We have not been involved in a major war anywhere, and consequently our economy has been huge. We are the most prosperous nation in the world. Things, despite what you might read in various newspapers, are going extremely well. And in fact, the whole world has sort of risen, not necessarily on the U.S.'s coattails or anything, but as part of this overall peace, so to speak. Other countries are engaged in hideous wars here and there, but those that are not, the people have been lifted out of poverty. The latest study I read said that less than 10% of the world now lives in dire, extreme poverty. And that's so much too many, but that's still a whole lot less than it used to be.
I think
things are getting better.
I think the State Department once said the 90s were maybe the most peaceful, prosperous time in human history. Probably.
Yes, I believe that.
Yeah. Okay, so there don't want to run out of time, but let's see.
Got one more question.
One more question. Okay. Let's see. Oh yeah, what do your primary sources look like? Do you sit at a desk with a pile of 18th century doctor's textbooks? I mean, have your
I
choice
have
sources.
some of those, yeah.
Yeah.
No, primary sources are always important to either a historian or a writer of historical fiction, but they can take many forms, and especially with the internet being what it is nowadays, it is easier to find, scans of historical documents or transcribed documents that still preserve the initial. And one of the most important things that I look for is things that were written by people of the period where I'm working, because that will give you a sense not only of the language that was used, but of the concerns of the person who wrote it and of their personality. It always comes through in the writing, especially if they're writing letters or diary entries, and that way you get the sense of a real person. If you're reading a textbook, you don't, because again, it's trying to convey information rather than personality. So that's just one of the reasons why primary sources are important. That said, one thing that is considered a primary source is the newspapers of a period. Okay, it's true, that would give you the news of the day, but newspapers in the 18th century were not any more accurate than newspapers today.
No, frequently biased.
Very much. They always have been, they always will be. And beyond that, some of it is just simple inaccuracy. I mean, I've been writing these books for 30 years. I've been interviewed by thousands of people, and I have read hundreds of the interviews. And to begin with, they all ask the same questions: how did you write these books, et cetera, et cetera. And to the point that I have a little thing which I can make look unrehearsed, but it's totally rehearsed. They get the same answer word for word every single time, so I know what I told them, and yet what comes out in their transcription is not at all the same thing. They interject things that they thought they heard. They interject their own take on things, which is not what I said, and it gives a different impression, or it's just a mistake. For instance, there are 3 universities in Arizona where I live. I got 2 of my degrees at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff. I worked for 12 years at Arizona State University in Tempe as a professor. I have absolutely nothing to do with the University of Arizona in Tucson. So I tell people, they say, where did you get your education? And I tell them, and later I say, and I mention working at ASU and all that. So it comes back at least half the time it says either that I worked at or I got my degrees from the University of Arizona, because all they picked up on was the 2 words, university and Arizona.
Yeah.
And so that's, totally without malice. It's just wrong. So 50 years from now, someone researching my life might look at that and say, well, she went to the University of Arizona, let me get her grades from there and see what they tell me, and they'd find out I'd never been there. So what then? They write something that says, oh, this person was a notorious liar and made up her background and all that.
Discerning where information comes from is very important, because there is very biased so-called news source out today.
Well, there's that too. I mean, there's deliberate bias and misleading and misinterpretation and misinforming. And then there's a lot of erroneous stuff that's, not that bad, but it's wrong.
Yeah. Well, Diana, thank you very much for sitting down with me. It's been an
pleasure,
absolute
Alex.
pleasure.
Yeah.
And